Karma hits. Fake love, real terror. Summary. Meh. David, a broke young man drowning in debt, devises a deceptive plan to trick his parents into lending him money. Desperate, he hires Sarah, an unknown but talented actress, to pose as his girlfriend and accompany him to his rural family home. The goal is simple: convince his parents they need to fund his future marriage under the guise of a business investment. Initially, the plan unfolds smoothly. Sarah plays her role well, and David's family welcomes her warmly. However, beneath the surface of their laughter and joyful facade, strange and eerie occurrences begin to unravel. Sarah feels an inexplicable chill as unseen eyes seem to follow her. Objects move on their own, doors creak in the night, and shadows flit across the walls. Even David, cocky and carefree, begins to experience terrifying visions. The air grows heavy with dread, and an ancient secret begins to surface, hinting that the house and David's lies have awakened something vengeful. As reality crumbles, their plan turns into a horrifying nightmare. Here is a detailed and engaging expansion of Part 1, The Desperate Plan, written with suspense, drama, and rich emotional expression. Part 1. The Desperate Plan. David sat slumped in the corner of a dimly lit apartment, the last rays of sunlight filtering through grimy windows, casting eerie patterns on the peeling walls. His mind raced like a clockwork machine spinning out of control. Bills, loans, and the threats of loan sharks loomed over him like a vulture circling a dying animal. The unpaid debts had begun to feel like an iron noose tightening around his throat, and the sound of footsteps outside his apartment sent his pulse spiking with paranoia. He grabbed a crumpled notice from the floor. Final notice, payment overdue? David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Final notice. Same words every time. Final for who? Me. The idea hit him, then a flash of reckless inspiration that pulsed through his desperation like a shot of adrenaline. His parents back in the countryside were kind-hearted, naive people. They had always doted on him, the only son, and yearned for him to settle down. If I bring home a girl, he muttered to himself, tell them we're ready to marry. They'll give me the money I need for a future business. He paused, eyes narrowing as he pieced it together in his mind. It's perfect. Just enough to pay the sharks off, start fresh. It's not a lie, just a white lie. But the plan required someone convincing. A girl who could act the part, play his doting fiancée to perfection. That's when he thought of Sarah Mitchell. Sarah sat at the farthest corner of a cheap diner, nervously tearing a napkin to shreds as her half-eaten sandwich went cold. Life had not been kind to her. A struggling theater actress with no gigs and mounting tuition debts, she'd already pawned most of her belongings to scrape through the last semester. A promise of success on the stage had turned into endless rejections and unpaid bills. Her phone buzzed. A message from David lit up the cracked screen. Need help. Quick gig. Pays well. Urgent. Sarah stared at the message, suspicion creeping over her. David was an old friend from her acting class, never serious, always scheming. But pays well was enough to draw her curiosity. She replied with a simple, where the meeting took place in a rundown cafe with flickering lights and cracked vinyl seats. David leaned forward, hands clasped together, voice low and persuasive. Across from him, Sarah raised an eyebrow, her skepticism obvious. So let me get this straight, she said, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her lips. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend, meet your family, and help you? Scam them into giving you money for a fake business. Not a scam, just a performance, David corrected, though even he winced at the word scam. Look, they're old-fashioned. If I say I want to get married, they'll insist on helping out. My parents have some savings. I just need enough to pay my debts and set myself straight. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms. And what happens when they realize there's no wedding, no business? You're playing with people's trust, David's face darkened. For a moment, the mask of charm slipped, and she glimpsed the raw desperation beneath. You think I want to do this? I have loan sharks threatening to break my legs, Sarah. I don't have options. I need this. Her expression softened just slightly, though she didn't say so out loud. Sarah had seen that look before, the hopeless stare of someone clinging to a last shred of hope. She knew what it felt like to be at rock bottom. How much, she asked quietly. David's eyes lit up like a gambler hitting the jackpot. I'll pay you $2,000. Plus expenses. It's just one weekend, Sarah. One trip. You'll be out of there before you know it. Sarah drummed her fingers on the table, chewing her lip. Rent was overdue, tuition needed paying. And it wasn't like acting gigs were pouring in. A quiet voice in her mind whispered, just one role. One performance. Fine, she said, holding up a hand to cut off his plea. But we do this my way. I need backstory, details, everything. If I'm playing your girlfriend, I'm going to be believable. I'm not letting you get me killed by angry parents or pissed off loan sharks. David's relief was almost palpable as he grinned. You're perfect for this, Sarah. Thank you, don't thank me yet, she replied, grabbing her coat. You might regret asking me to play your doting fiancé. That evening, the two sat together in David's apartment, piecing together their fabricated love story. Sarah demanded precision where they met, how long they'd been dating, her favorite foods. His quirks, every little detail had to be flawless. You're meticulous, David muttered, half impressed, half annoyed as Sarah scribbled notes furiously in her notebook. You hired an actress. David, she shot back, not looking up. This is what I do. You want your money? Then I'm making this believable. Hours passed as they practiced their roles. David found himself surprised at Sarah's dedication. She transformed before his eyes, slipping effortlessly into the character of a warm, sweet girlfriend. Her smile softened. Her voice turned affectionate. Her gestures natural. For fleeting moments, David almost believed it himself. Then she dropped the act, her sharp eyes pinning him in place. Remember, she said coldly, this is just a job. Don't get used to it. David swallowed and nodded. But deep down, the lies already felt too comfortable. The morning of their departure arrived with a gray, overcast sky. David waited outside his building as Sarah approached, dressed simply but elegantly, a small suitcase in hand. Her face betrayed no trace of nervousness. She was in character now. Ready, he asked, forcing a smile. Sarah adjusted her scarf, giving him a tight nod. Let's get this over with. As the taxi pulled away, David stared out at the sprawling city, his heart pounding in his chest. The plan felt solid on paper, but the weight of it pressed against him now. What if they got caught? What if Sarah slipped up? What if his parents somehow saw through the lie? Beside him, Sarah flipped through her notebook, muttering their backstory under her breath like an actor rehearsing lines before the final curtain. David glanced at her, so calm, so composed, and for the briefest moment, he envied her. It'll be fine, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Sarah didn't reply. She stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Neither of them noticed the dark clouds gathering in the distance, a silent omen of the storm that awaited them. Part 2. The journey home. The old taxi rattled as it sped along the winding country roads, each bump in the cracked pavement jostling its passengers like stones in a tin can. The further they moved away from the bustling city, the quieter and more desolate the landscape became. Rows of crooked trees loomed like shadowy sentinels, their branches swaying and whispering secrets to the cold wind. Inside the cab, David sat stiffly in the passenger seat, one hand tapping nervously against his knee. Behind him, Sarah was crammed against the door, her notebook closed but gripped tightly in her lap as if it were a shield. Her face, pale and taut, stared out at the passing fields that stretched endlessly into the gray horizon. The silence in the car was thick and suffocating, broken only by the rattling hum of the taxi engine. All right, David finally spoke, breaking the tense stillness. He turned in his seat, his voice low and hurried. Just remember what we practiced, all right? Don't overthink it. You're my girlfriend, Sarah. You're happy to meet my parents. You're excited about our future. We've been dating for over a year, and you love coffee but hate tea. You snore when you're exhausted. And we met at a charity theater event. Sarah finished for him, not bothering to look at him. Her tone was clipped, sharp, betraying the nerves she tried to suppress. I've got it, David. I'm a professional. Stop reminding me like I'm an idiot. David sighed, leaning back into his seat. I'm just making sure. If you screw up, this whole thing falls apart. She turned toward him then, her voice icy. And if you screw up, I'm out of here. Don't forget that the driver glanced at them briefly through the rearview mirror, his eyebrows raising in curiosity at their curt exchange. "You two sound like an old married couple already," he muttered under his breath with a chuckle, though no one laughed. Sarah rolled her eyes and turned her gaze back to the window. "Why couldn't you have picked a family in a normal place?" she mumbled, her breath fogging up the glass. "It's like we're driving into the middle of nowhere." David gave a humorless chuckle. "Because it is the middle of nowhere. Welcome to my home village, Sarah. Population too small to count." The landscape grew darker as they traveled deeper into the countryside, the gray sky turning an unsettling shade of violet. The tall, twisted trees lining the road seemed to crowd in closer, their gnarled limbs clawing at the cab like they wanted to snatch it off the road. Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling tightening in her chest. "Do your parents know we're coming?" she asked suddenly, trying to fill the silence. David hesitated before answering. "They know I'm bringing someone special. I didn't say much else. I figured that'd be enough of a surprise." "A surprise?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "Great. Nothing like showing up unannounced with a fake girlfriend to really make their day." David shot her a look. "Stop overthinking it. They'll love you. Just smile, act nice, and don't mess this up." Sarah bit back a sharp retort. The closer they got, the more irritated she felt, not just at David but at herself for agreeing to this ridiculous plan. She had played countless roles on stage, but this felt different, wrong. The taxi turned down a narrow dirt path lined with crumbling stone walls. The air grew colder, and the faint mist that hung in the fields now swirled in tendrils across the road, like ghostly fingers reaching for the tires. Sarah shivered involuntarily. "How much further?" she asked. David squinted ahead, his expression hard to read. "We're close. Just a few more minutes." When the taxi finally pulled up to the Bennett's home, Sarah's first impression was of something old and worn but stubbornly standing against the passage of time. The two-story house sat at the edge of a thick, looming forest, its chipped shutters rattling faintly in the wind. Vines twisted along the faded wooden walls, like veins on aged skin. Sarah stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. But the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Charming place," she muttered under her breath. David ignored her sarcasm as he paid the driver and grabbed their bags. "This is it. Just stay calm, okay?" Before she could reply, a voice boomed from the front porch. "David." "You're finally here." An older man with graying hair and a weathered face rushed toward them, his arms open wide. Mr. Bennett had an air of stern authority, but his smile, broad and genuine, seemed to soften him. "Hey, Dad," David said, forcing a smile as he dropped the bags. He stepped forward to embrace the man briefly, stiff and awkward. "And this must be Mr. Bennett." Turned toward Sarah, his gaze curious and warm but searching. Sarah plastered on her brightest, most convincing smile and stepped forward, extending her hand. "Hi, Mr. Bennett. I'm Sarah. It's so lovely to meet you." Mr. Bennett hesitated for just a moment, something flickering across his face before he took her hand, shaking it firmly. "Sarah, huh? Well, aren't you a pretty thing? Welcome to our home." Sarah's smile didn't falter, though the way his eyes lingered on her sent an unexpected chill crawling up her spine. "Where's Mom?" David asked quickly, cutting the tension. "She's inside cooking up a storm. Wait till you see, it's a feast," Mr. Bennett replied, his voice booming with pride. "She's been talking about you bringing someone home for years, boy. You've made her a very happy woman today." David smiled tightly, but Sarah noticed how his jaw twitched, the strain of the lie pulling at him already. As they walked toward the house, Sarah's unease deepened. Something about the place felt off, the way the wind whispered through the trees, the heavy silence that seemed to surround the house like a shroud. She looked back at the forest, the shadows beneath its canopy unnaturally dark. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, something shifting just beyond the trees. She blinked, and it was gone. "You coming?" David's voice jolted her from her thoughts. He was already at the door, holding it open for her. "Yeah," she said quickly, shaking off the feeling. "It's just your imagination," she told herself. "It's just a house. Just a job." As Sarah stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the old wooden floor creaking beneath her feet, She couldn't help but feel as though the house had swallowed her whole. Part 3. The warm welcome. The creaking door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with faded family portraits and antique furniture. The house exuded a feeling of age, each crevice and corner holding stories whispered to the wind. Sarah stepped cautiously into the entryway. The smell of home-cooked food mixed with the faint mustiness of old wood wrapping around her like an invisible net. Come in, a cheerful voice rang out, breaking the eerie quiet. From the kitchen, Mrs. Bennet emerged, wiping her hands on an apron streaked with flour. Her face was kind, her eyes crinkling with joy, as she took in the sight of David and Sarah. "David," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. David stiffened, but returned the hug awkwardly. A boyish grin forced onto his face. "Hi, Mom," he muttered, glancing nervously at Sarah, who stood a step behind him. Mrs. Bennet turned her attention to Sarah, her eyes lighting up with genuine warmth. "And this must be Sarah," she said, rushing forward and taking Sarah's hands in hers. "Oh, sweetheart, it's so good to finally meet you. David's told us so much about you." Sarah, maintaining her perfect performance, let out a small, delighted laugh. "I hope it's all good things, Mrs. Bennet, of course, dear." "And call me Margaret," she replied, giving Sarah's hands a gentle squeeze. Her touch was soft, but there was something in her gaze, just a flicker of something Sarah couldn't quite place. The living room soon filled with noise and movement as distant relatives began to arrive, their voices mingling into a chaotic hum of laughter and cheerful chatter. Coats were tossed onto hooks, and dishes of steaming food were paraded onto the long dining table. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and herbs wafted through the air, a comforting mask over the unease Sarah still couldn't shake. As introductions unfolded, Sarah's performance was flawless. She laughed at the right moments, held Margaret's arm affectionately when asked about the wedding plans, and shared carefully rehearsed anecdotes about how David proposed. And then he dropped the ring, Sarah said with a laugh, her voice full of affectionate charm. "Right in a puddle." You should have seen his face. The room erupted with laughter. Even Mr. Bennet, stoic and reserved, cracked a grin, shaking his head at his son. "That sounds about right for David," he muttered, earning a playful glare from David himself. David watched Sarah in awe as she seamlessly won over his entire family. She moved through the room like she belonged there, her charm disarming even the nosiest of aunts and uncles. Her laugh was contagious, her smile radiant. For fleeting moments, David forgot that it was all a lie. Sarah, Aunt Patricia called from across the room, clutching a glass of wine. "Do you cook? You know how important that is in this family." "Oh, of course," Sarah said with a beaming smile, rising to the occasion. "I'm no professional, but I make a killer roast chicken." "David loves it." David nearly choked on his drink, but no one noticed. The relatives turned to him expectantly. "Is that true?" David and Patricia asked, smirking. "Yeah, it's great," David mumbled, forcing a smile. "Best roast chicken I've ever had." The room erupted with approval, and Sarah shot David a quick glance, a silent warning to keep up the act. As the evening wore on, the Bennets' hospitality grew warmer, but the house itself seemed to grow colder. Sarah noticed small things no one else seemed to see. The air in the corner of the living room felt thicker, like it pressed down on her lungs. A family photo hanging crookedly on the wall seemed to tilt further every time she glanced at it, and for a split second, she swore one of the faces in the photo looked wrong. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. "It's just the nerves, Sarah. It's all in your head." After dinner, Margaret insisted that Sarah help her in the kitchen. "It's been so long since I've had a young woman's company," Margaret said, smiling warmly. Sarah followed her into the dimly lit kitchen, where pots and pans sat piled in the sink. Margaret handed Sarah a tea towel and began scrubbing dishes, her tone light but probing. So Margaret began, glancing at Sarah with an unreadable expression. "You and David, you're very close, aren't you?" Sarah swallowed, keeping her smile steady. "Yes, he means a lot to me. We've been through a lot together." Margaret scrubbed a pot harder, the metal screeching faintly against the sponge. "He never brought anyone home before, you know. He's always been distant." "Well, I guess we found each other at the right time, Sarah said softly, forcing warmth into her voice. Margaret stopped scrubbing and turned to face her. It's funny though, she murmured, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Sometimes it's hard to tell when someone's telling the truth. The air in the kitchen seemed to freeze. For a moment, neither woman moved. Sarah's smile faltered ever so slightly as her heart hammered in her chest. Then Margaret's face softened, and she let out a laugh. Oh, look at me. I'm just rambling. Pay me no mind, dear. Sarah let out a nervous laugh, but her hands trembled slightly as she dried the dishes. When they rejoined the group, David was laughing with his cousins, his earlier anxiety replaced with confidence. Sarah pulled him aside, her voice low and sharp. Your mother is sharp, David. Too sharp. She's watching me. David's smile faltered. She's harmless. You're doing great. Just keep it up until we leave tomorrow. I don't know. Sarah glanced over her shoulder. The living room seemed darker now, the shadows cast by the firelight stretching unnaturally across the walls. Something feels wrong in this house, David frowned. Don't start, Sarah. It's an old house. It creaks, and the lights flicker. You're overthinking it, Sarah sighed, dropping the argument. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just nerves. By nightfall, the relatives had left, and the house had fallen into a heavy, uneasy silence. Sarah lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The bed beneath her was hard, the blanket scratchy and cold. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The creaks of the old house seemed louder now, more deliberate, like footsteps pacing outside her door. Tap, tap. Sarah's breath caught. She sat up, her heart racing as the sound grew louder. She strained to listen, every muscle in her body tense. Then, silence. ... It's nothing, she whispered, lying back down and pulling the blankets up to her chin. But just as her eyes fluttered shut, she heard it again. A faint whisper. This time it was close, too close. Part 4. Eerie signs began. The guest room was colder than Sarah expected. The old wooden bed creaked under her weight as she sat on the edge, hugging herself for warmth. A small oil lamp flickered on the nightstand, casting uneven shadows that danced across the peeling floral wallpaper. For a moment, the soft hum of the house settling was the only sound until a sudden thud broke the silence. Sarah froze. The noise was faint, like something falling in the hallway outside. She turned her head slowly toward the door, her heart skipping a beat. It's just the wind, she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled slightly. But when she looked at the door, she noticed something strange. The doorknob, the old brass fixture that gleamed faintly in the lamplight, was twitching. Slowly it turned to the right, creaking ever so softly as if someone on the other side were trying to open it. Sarah shot up from the bed, her pulse pounding in her ears. David, she called out softly, trying to keep her voice steady. No reply. The knob stilled. Silence. Sarah took a cautious step forward, swallowing the lump in her throat. Hello, she whispered into the quiet. The stillness that followed felt suffocating. Suddenly she heard it again, soft and distant, this time a faint whisper that sounded like it came from just beyond the door. Her blood ran cold. A loud knock on the door made her jump. Sarah, it was David's voice, his tone impatient. She let out a shaky breath, her nerves fraying. Yeah, you okay in there? He asked, his voice muffled through the door. You were talking to yourself, Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering near the knob. Someone was at the door, David. I heard something. What David's voice was dismissive, a mix of irritation and exhaustion. Come on, it's an old house. The floors creak, the pipes groan, it's not haunted. Sarah, she opened the door just enough to peer at him. He looked disheveled, his dark hair tousled and his shirt wrinkled. I'm serious, David. The doorknob was moving, and I heard whispering. David let out a low groan, running a hand through his hair. Sarah, stop. You're freaking yourself out over nothing. My parents can't know you're getting jumpy. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're doing great. Just keep it together, okay? We leave tomorrow, and you'll get paid. No reason to scare yourself. Sarah stared at him, searching for some sign of concern in his face. But all she saw was impatience. Fine, she muttered, stepping back into the room. "But if I hear it again, you won't," he cut in. His tone clipped. "Get some sleep." David turned and walked down the dim hallway, leaving Sarah standing in the doorway, feeling more alone than ever. Hours passed and Sarah lay in bed, wide awake. The flickering lamp had long since burned out, leaving the room shrouded in shadows. Every creak of the old house echoed through her head, louder and sharper than before. She told herself it was just the unfamiliar sounds of the countryside. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The whispers returned first. Faint, like the sound of breath brushing against her ear. Sarah, her eyes flew open, her body going rigid. "Who's there?" she choked out, but her words fell flat in the suffocating darkness. A cold chill ran down her spine as she slowly turned her head toward the far corner of the room. At first there was nothing, just shadow. But then, in the darkness, a shape began to form. A woman. A figure stood there, partially obscured in the shadows, her face hidden behind a cascade of long, dark hair. Her silhouette was faint but unmistakable, as if she were made of the darkness itself. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, it only stood there, watching. In a flash, Sarah threw herself out of the bed, scrambling for the door. She fumbled with the knob, her fingers slick with sweat, and flung it open, stumbling into the dimly lit hallway. She gasped for breath, clutching her chest as her heart thundered. The hallway stretched before her, silent and empty, but she could still feel it, the eyes watching her. Sarah didn't return to her room. Instead, she crept downstairs to the kitchen, desperate for light and a distraction. The small clock on the wall read 2:47 a.m. She grabbed a glass of water, her hands trembling as she poured. "Pull it together," she whispered, taking a shaky sip. "It's not real. It's just exhaustion. It's..." The faint sound of footsteps interrupted her. Slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway behind her. Sarah froze, her grip tightening on the glass. She turned her head slightly, her breath shallow. "David," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. Sarah turned back toward the kitchen table, only to stop dead in her tracks. On the far wall, a family portrait hung crookedly, just as it had earlier, but this time, something was different. The face of the eldest woman in the photo, the one standing at the back, was no longer looking forward. Her painted eyes were turned, staring directly at Sarah. The glass slipped from Sarah's fingers and shattered on the floor. David found her in the kitchen an hour later, sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets, knees pulled to her chest. "What the hell are you doing down here?" he demanded, though his voice softened when he saw the look on her face, pale, hollow, and terrified. "I'm not imagining it," David, Sarah whispered. "There's something in this house. I don't know what it is, but it's here." Watching me, David crouched beside her, grabbing her shoulder gently. "Sarah, listen to me. You're just tired, okay? It's an old house. Old houses are creepy. That's all this is. You've got to hold it together, or this whole thing is going to fall apart." "You didn't see it," she said shakily, her voice cracking. "You didn't hear it," David sighed, running a hand down his face. "Just get some rest. You'll feel better in the morning." Sarah said nothing, her eyes fixed on the broken glass shimmering on the floor like shards of a nightmare. As David helped her back upstairs, neither of them noticed the faint whisper that followed them through the hallway. Liar. Part 5. The Ancient Secret. The next morning, sunlight streamed weakly through the guest room window, though it did little to lift Sarah's spirits. She had barely slept, her mind haunted by the memory of the shadowed figure and the family portrait's accusing stare. "Just one more day," she muttered to herself as she splashed cold water on her face in the small, creaky bathroom. "You can get through this." Downstairs, the murmur of voices and clinking dishes drifted up, signaling the start of another day in the Bennett household. Sarah forced a smile onto her face and headed down, her practice roll sliding back into place like a mask. The dining room was alive with chatter. Margaret Bennett, David's mother, bustled around the table, serving eggs and biscuits with warm smiles. At the far end of the table sat Aunt Margaret, an older, thin woman with piercing eyes and a strange presence that set her apart from the others. Her silver hair was neatly braided, and her long, bony fingers curled around a steaming cup of tea. "Sarah." "There you are," Margaret chirped cheerfully. "Come, sit. Eat while it's hot." Sarah slid into the chair beside David, who looked far too relaxed for someone orchestrating such an elaborate lie. He shot her a quick grin. "Sleep well like a rock," Sarah lied through gritted teeth. Before she could take a bite, Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the table chatter like a knife. "David," she said slowly, her sharp gaze fixing on him. "Is this the girl you plan to marry?" David stiffened, his fork hovering midair. "Yes, Aunt Margaret." "This is Sarah." Aunt Margaret's eyes flickered to Sarah, narrowing as if inspecting her soul. "Lovely," she murmured, though her tone was anything but warm. "Why don't you two sit with me after breakfast? I'd like to read your horoscopes." Sarah blinked, feeling her pulse quicken. "Horoscopes?" David scoffed. "Come on, Aunt Margaret, you and your fortunes. It's just for fun, right?" Aunt Margaret didn't smile. "Fun? Oh, David, don't be foolish. Reading the stars is never just fun." Margaret shot her sister-in-law a disapproving look. "Margaret, leave the kids alone. They've been through enough with the drive here." But Aunt Margaret ignored her, her stare still locked on Sarah. "The stars don't lie. If they've chosen each other, the stars will confirm it." Later that morning, Sarah and David found themselves seated in the dimly lit parlor, across from Aunt Margaret. The heavy curtains blocked out most of the light, giving the room an oppressive gloom. A small wooden table sat between them, a deck of worn, yellowed cards and a small brass dish with smoldering incense on top. Sarah shifted uncomfortably as the incense's smoke curled around them, its scent thick and suffocating. "This is lovely," she murmured weakly. David sighed, slouching in his chair. "Aunt Margaret, really shush." Aunt Margaret's sharp command silenced him. She took the deck of cards in her hands, shuffling them slowly, her long fingers moving with practiced precision. "Give me your dates of birth." David rattled his off first, rolling his eyes. Sarah hesitated, her nerves twisting in her stomach. She finally gave hers, her voice soft. Aunt Margaret closed her eyes, whispering something Sarah couldn't understand as she dealt out the cards. Her movements were deliberate, her expression growing more serious with each card placed on the table. The room seemed to darken. Sarah glanced at David, who was staring at his aunt with faint amusement, clearly unbothered by the ritual. Then Aunt Margaret opened her eyes. Her gaze fell on the cards, and her face went pale, the color draining so quickly Sarah almost cried out. "What? What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking. Aunt Margaret didn't respond immediately. Her hands hovered over the final card, trembling slightly. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a deep, unsettling fear. "You've disturbed something," she whispered hoarsely. David straightened up, his smirk vanishing. "What are you talking about?" Aunt Margaret's voice grew sharper, almost frantic. "I see shadows clinging to you both, shadows of unfinished business, of broken promises and lies. This house remembers, David. The land remembers." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Shadows? What are you saying?" Aunt Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near hiss. "This family carries a debt, an old one. And when debts are ignored, they fester. They become curses. You may have come here to deceive, but the house knows the truth. It always does." David scoffed, though his voice wavered. "This is ridiculous. It's just a game." "Stop scaring Sarah." Aunt Margaret snapped her head toward him, her eyes burning. "The stars do not play games, David. Lies invite punishment. Do you understand me? Punishment." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. David practically dragged Sarah out of the parlor, muttering angrily under his breath. "She's crazy. I told you she's nuts." Sarah followed him silently, her mind spinning with Aunt Margaret's words. Shadows. Punishment. Curses. She didn't want to admit it, but the woman's fear had been real palpable. "She's just trying to mess with us," David continued as they climbed the stairs. "Old people love this superstitious garbage. Don't let her get in your head." Sarah stopped at the landing, her voice quiet. "But what if she's right?" David turned, his expression hardening. "She's not. Get some rest. We'll be gone soon." That night, as Sarah lay awake in bed, Aunt Margaret's words echoed in her mind: lies invite punishment. The house groaned softly, as though agreeing. Outside the window, the wind howled, and for the briefest moment, Sarah thought she saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, still watching. When she blinked, it was gone. But the whisper returned, curling faintly in the darkness of the room. Liar. Part 6. The first nightmare. The night descended over the Bennett house like a suffocating blanket. The moon outside was a thin crescent, its faint light barely piercing through the heavy clouds. A quiet stillness had settled over the house, but it was the kind of silence that didn't feel restful, it felt watchful. David lay sprawled on the narrow bed in his childhood room, the mattress creaking with every shift of his body. He stared at the ceiling, restless. Aunt Margaret's warning from earlier had left an unpleasant aftertaste in his mind, though he brushed it off with his usual arrogance. "Shadows," he muttered to himself, scoffing softly. "Crazy old bat still." Sleep didn't come easily. The room felt colder than before, and the drafty window rattled softly against the wind outside. He turned on his side, pulling the blanket tighter around him, and finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. Scratch. Scratch. The sound was faint at first, soft, like fingernails grazing wood. David stirred, his eyelids fluttering. The room was pitch black, save for a sliver of pale moonlight filtering through the window. He blinked, disoriented. Scratch. Scratch. He sat up, his body stiff, the sound pulling him fully awake. It was coming from the other side of the bedroom door. "Sarah," he called out groggily, his voice rough. There was no response. Scratch. 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 The noise grew louder, more deliberate. It sounded less like nails and more like claws now, digging into the wood. David's stomach turned uneasily. "Who's there?" Silence. The air grew heavy. David's breath came faster, his pulse thundering in his ears. He stared at the door, waiting, his eyes straining in the dark. Then a shadow. The faint strip of moonlight beneath the door was interrupted by something moving, a pair of feet, bare and pale, standing just outside his room. They didn't move. They just stood there. David felt his throat tighten. "Mom?" Dad, no answer. He slid out of bed carefully, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The scratching had stopped, but the silence was worse, thick, ominous, like the air itself was holding its breath. He crept toward the door, every creak of the floorboards beneath him like a gunshot in the quiet. The shadow outside shifted again. David hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. For a moment he was certain that whatever was on the other side was waiting for him. He swallowed hard, then flung the door open. The hallway was empty. David's heart was pounding as he stepped out, the floor cold beneath his feet. He glanced left and right, but there was no sign of anyone. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and lifeless, the faded wallpaper peeling like old skin. But as he turned to go back inside, he saw them. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the faint moonlight, figures stood in the darkness, motionless, watching. Their shapes were indistinct, blending into the shadows, but he could see enough, tall, unnaturally thin, their heads tilted ever so slightly. David froze. He tried to blink the figures away, tried to convince himself it was his tired eyes playing tricks. But the shadows didn't vanish. Instead, they shifted, as though inching closer without moving at all. The air turned freezing. David stumbled back into his room, slamming the door shut and bolting it. He leaned against the door, gasping for breath. For a long time he stayed there, listening. Nothing. In the guest room down the hall, Sarah wasn't faring much better. She was tossing and turning, trapped in a dream that felt far too real. She stood in the middle of a large, unfamiliar room. Dust floated through the air like tiny ghosts, and the furniture was covered in old, yellowed sheets. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. The sound of soft weeping reached her ears. Sarah turned toward the source, her pulse quickening. At the far end of the room sat a woman, hunched over, her face buried in her hands. Long black hair cascaded down her back, her frail shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "Are you okay?" Sarah whispered, moving closer. The woman didn't respond. The weeping grew louder, more anguished. Sarah stopped a few feet away, her body trembling. "Miss, can I help you?" Slowly. The woman's sobs turned into a soft, guttural wail, a sound so filled with grief it made Sarah's chest tighten. The woman's head began to lift. Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to run, to wake up, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. Inch by inch, the woman's face emerged from behind her hair, her skin ashen, hollow, her mouth contorted into a scream of endless sorrow. Her eyes, black pits of nothingness, snapped open, locking onto Sarah's. The wail turned into a piercing scream. Sarah jolted awake, sitting upright in the bed, her body drenched in sweat. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The room around her was dark and silent, but the sound of the woman's scream still echoed faintly in her ears. It took her a moment to realize she wasn't alone. She felt it before she saw it. A presence in the corner of the room. Slowly, she turned her head. The corner was shrouded in darkness, but she could see it, a figure standing there, its head tilted just slightly, as though it were watching her. Sarah didn't scream. She couldn't. Her voice was trapped in her throat as she stared at the unmoving shadow. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering to herself over and over, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." When she opened them again, the shadow was gone, but the cold remained. Morning came far too slowly. David and Sarah found each other in the hallway, both looking pale and hollow-eyed. Neither spoke about what they had seen, but the tension between them said enough. "Rough night," David muttered, forcing a smile that looked brittle. Sarah shot him a glare. "I'm not imagining this, David. Something's wrong with this house." David looked away, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's just stress. We'll be out of here soon." Sarah stared at him, her voice low and sharp. "You didn't see what I saw?" David didn't answer. He couldn't bring himself to admit that he had seen something too, something that made his skin crawl just thinking about it. From the top of the staircase, Aunt Margaret watched them quietly, her expression unreadable. She whispered something under her breath as her gaze lingered on David and Sarah. The house remembers. Part 7. The truth unravels. The morning sun did little to brighten the atmosphere inside the Bennett house. Its weak light barely filtered through the heavy curtains, casting dull beams onto the creaky wooden floors. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, clutching a steaming cup of tea to warm her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Across from her, David shoveled a plate of eggs into his mouth, as if the events of the night before had never happened. "You're acting like nothing's wrong," Sarah said sharply, breaking the tense silence. David glanced up, his fork hovering midair. "Because nothing is wrong." Sarah, her hand slammed the table, the sound startling even her. "Don't you dare say that. You heard it, didn't you? You saw something too. Don't lie to me, David." David set his fork down with a clatter, his jaw tightening. "I had a bad dream. That's all. This house is old, it creaks, it makes noises. It's not haunted." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "A bad dream?" "I woke up to something watching me from the corner of my room, David. A thing. I couldn't even move." "You're exhausted. We both are. It's just you don't believe me." Her voice dropped to a whisper, her hands trembling. "You don't believe me." David opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps silenced him. Aunt Margaret appeared in the doorway, her thin frame draped in a shawl. Her sharp eyes flitted between the two of them, lingering on Sarah a moment longer. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, though there was something in her voice, an edge of knowing. David forced a smile, his tone overly light. "We're fine, Aunt Margaret. Just tired." Aunt Margaret's gaze fixed on him, unblinking. "David, I need a word with you." Alone, David's brow furrowed. "Now?" "Yes, now." Before David could protest, Aunt Margaret turned and walked stiffly toward the parlor, leaving him no choice but to follow. Sarah watched them disappear, a sinking feeling knotting in her stomach. The parlor was dim and stale, filled with the lingering scent of incense from the day before. Aunt Margaret stood by the window, her silhouette rigid against the pale light. David hesitated near the door, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "What's this about, Aunt Margaret?" he asked casually, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. She turned to face him, her expression cold and unreadable. Sid David sighed but obeyed, slumping into the nearest chair. "Look, if this is about last night, do you know what you've done?" Aunt Margaret's voice was low, sharp as glass. David blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" Aunt Margaret stepped closer, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor. "You think this is just a game, don't you? Bringing a girl here under false pretenses, weaving your lies to manipulate your family." David frowned, sitting up straighter. "Wait, how do I know, David?" Aunt Margaret's voice dropped to a near whisper, her gaze cutting into him like a knife. "And so does the house." David's throat went dry. "You're not making any sense." Aunt Margaret pointed a thin, trembling finger at him. "This family carries a stain, an old black mark. Do you know what happens when lies are spoken in a house that already bears a curse?" David stared at her, unable to answer. "The spirits here, they don't sleep. They don't forget. Every betrayal, every broken promise feeds them, gives them life. And your deceit has awakened them. You've invited them into our world." David let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Spirits? Curses? This is insane, is it?" Aunt Margaret snapped. "Did you not hear them last night? Did you not see them?" David's smirk faltered. He thought back to the figures in the hallway, the way they seemed to shift closer without moving. He had told himself it was a dream, a trick of the darkness. But was it? "Your lies," Aunt Margaret continued, her voice trembling with anger, "are like blood to them. They feed on it. And now, David, you've placed yourself and that poor girl right in their path." David stood abruptly, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to scare me. That's all this is, your creepy warnings and superstitions." Aunt Margaret's face hardened. "If you leave this place without fixing what you've done, they will follow you. The spirits will not stop. They will haunt you until the debt is paid." David opened his mouth to retort but froze. The temperature in the room had dropped suddenly, his breath misting in the cold air. Aunt Margaret's eyes flickered to the darkened corner of the parlor. David turned his head slowly. For a moment he thought he saw something, a shadow darker than the rest of the room, moving. "No," he whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real." Aunt Margaret gripped his arm tightly, her fingers cold as ice. "Believe me or not, David, the house knows the truth, and it will make you pay." David stormed out of the parlor minutes later, his face pale and his hands shaking. Sarah was waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, worry etched into her features. "What did she say?" she asked cautiously. "Nothing," David snapped, his voice harsh. "She's crazy. All of this is insane." Sarah grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "David, stop lying to yourself. You saw something last night, didn't you?" He looked away, his jaw clenched. "David," finally he exhaled shakily. "I don't know what I saw, okay? But Aunt Margaret's just trying to mess with us. We're leaving tomorrow. Everything will be fine." Sarah let go of his arm, her eyes narrowing. "Will it? Because I don't think this place wants us here." David, he didn't respond, walking briskly toward the stairs. That night, the air inside the house felt different, heavier, colder. The walls seemed to groan more often, as if the house itself were alive and breathing. Sarah lay awake again, staring at the ceiling as whispers drifted faintly through the darkness. ... Liar. Debt. Blood. In the distance, a door creaked open slowly, followed by the faint sound of footsteps, bare feet padding softly against the wood. Sarah pulled the covers tighter around herself, tears stinging her eyes. David lay in his room, staring at the locked door. Aunt Margaret's words echoed in his mind, "The spirits will not stop until the debt is paid." For the first time, David felt it, the truth sinking in like a stone in his chest. The house knew. And it was watching. Part 8. The Reckoning. The Bennett house felt different as the day gave way to dusk, a weight in the air that suffocated every breath. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, and the groaning of the old wood beneath the floor sounded less like creaks and more like whispers. Sarah paced anxiously in the guest room, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. "We need to leave, David." Now David stood by the window, staring blankly at the darkening forest outside. He hadn't said much since his conversation with Aunt Margaret, his bravado chipped away piece by piece. Sarah's voice sharpened, and he finally turned to face her, his expression tired and hollow. "Sarah, calm down," she hissed, her voice rising. "Something is wrong with this house. You know it. Don't stand there and act like I'm crazy." David rubbed his temples, trying to maintain control. "Look, we're leaving first thing in the morning. One more night, that's it." Sarah shook her head violently, her breath ragged. "There won't be a morning, David. Don't you get it? The house knows what you're doing. Your lies are tearing this place apart." Before David could respond, the light above them flickered once, then again before plunging the room into total darkness. The air turned icy. Sarah froze, her breath misting in front of her. "David." Thud. 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 The sound came from above, a slow, deliberate pounding that echoed through the ceiling. Both of them stared upward, their bodies rigid with terror. "Is that someone in the attic?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. David swallowed, trying to steady himself. "It's probably just Crash." The sound of shattering glass erupted downstairs, sending a tremor through the house. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward as the door to the room slammed shut on its own. David lunged for the handle, yanking it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. "Open. Open," he shouted, panic finally breaking through his denial. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the house, a sound that was not human. It reverberated through the walls, shaking the floor beneath their feet. "Liar. Thief." Sarah pressed her back against the wall, tears streaking down her face. "David, do something." The temperature dropped further, and suddenly the furniture moved. The chair in the corner scraped across the floor violently, its legs screeching against the wood. The lamp toppled off the nightstand, the bulb exploding with a burst of sparks. "Stop. Stop," David shouted, his voice cracking. The bed began to tremble, its old frame rattling violently. Sarah ducked as a framed photo flew off the wall and shattered just inches from her head. The whispering grew louder, angrier. "Debt. Must be paid. Lies." Blood. David fell to his knees, clutching his head. I'm sorry. The door flung open with a deafening bang. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps approached. Sarah grabbed David's arm, yanking him to his feet. "We're getting out of here." They bolted down the hallway, the floorboards trembling beneath their weight. As they ran, the paintings on the walls tilted and crashed to the ground, the glass shards scattering like razor-sharp rain. "Keep moving," David yelled. At the top of the staircase, they froze. The way down was blocked, every step was covered in debris that hadn't been there before: shattered wood, broken chairs, and toppled family photos. From behind them, the footsteps drew closer. Sarah turned back, her voice trembling. "David. It's coming." David spun around, and for the first time he saw it clearly. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and cloaked in shadow. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated malice. The air around it shimmered with cold, and its hollow voice rattled through their bones. "Lies. Must be paid." The figure raised a long, claw-like hand, and suddenly, David was yanked backward by an unseen force. He hit the floor hard, gasping for air as invisible claws seemed to wrap around his chest, pinning him down. "David!" Sarah screamed, reaching for him. The lights above flickered erratically as the shadowed figure loomed closer, its whispers now a deafening roar. "The debt will be paid." David choked, his body convulsing as if something were pulling the life from him. His eyes darted to Sarah. "Run," he gasped. "I'm not leaving you," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face as she fought against the icy wind that now tore through the hallway. The figure stepped closer, its darkness spreading like ink through the air. Sarah grabbed a splintered piece of wood from the floor and hurled it at the figure. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form wavering. "Get up, David. Get up," she screamed. David, trembling and pale, crawled toward her as the figure's whispers grew angrier, its rage almost tangible. The wind howled, and the walls seemed to close in, the house itself alive with fury. Together, they stumbled down the wreckage-covered stairs, the shadow pursuing them with unnatural speed. "Faster," Sarah shouted, dragging David toward the front door. The hallway groaned, the ceiling above them cracking violently. Plaster rained down as the shadow's presence loomed closer, its voice now shrieking in fury. "You cannot escape," Sarah threw herself at the front door, yanking the handle desperately. "It's locked." David stumbled forward, his strength waning. "Let me." The shadow's cold breath swept over them, and with one final surge of adrenaline, David threw his shoulder against the door. It burst open. They tumbled onto the porch, gasping for breath as the night air hit them like a lifeline. Behind them, the shadow stopped just at the threshold, its form twisting and writhing, as if trapped by an invisible barrier. Its hollow, rage-filled voice echoed through the trees. "The debt will be paid," and then the door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the stillness. They didn't stop running until they reached David's car, parked at the edge of the gravel drive. Sarah collapsed into the passenger seat, her entire body shaking, while David fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and he slammed on the gas, the tires skidding on the dirt road as they sped away. Neither of them looked back. For a long while, the only sound was the hum of the engine and their ragged breathing. David broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could control it. I didn't think." Sarah turned to him, her face pale, her voice trembling. "You woke something up, David, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." David's grip tightened on the wheel as the road stretched endlessly ahead. In the rearview mirror, the faint outline of the Bennett house disappeared into the distance, but its shadow still lingered in his mind. Part 9. The Escape and Aftermath. The car sped down the winding dirt road, its tires skidding against loose gravel as David gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. The forest loomed on either side, trees rushing past like black, twisted sentinels. Beside him, Sarah sat curled up in the passenger seat, staring blankly ahead, her face pale and streaked with tears. Neither of them spoke. The events of the night had left them hollow, as though the house had stripped something vital from them. David's mind raced. The image of the shadow, its rage, its whispers seared into his thoughts like a brand. His chest ached as if unseen claws still gripped him. His carefully orchestrated lie, the deception he thought he could control, had spiraled into something far beyond his understanding. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. "It's not real. It can't be real." Sarah turned her head slowly, her voice flat, lifeless. "It is real, David. You saw it. You heard it. Don't lie to yourself anymore." He didn't respond. He couldn't. Hours passed before they reached the outskirts of the city. David pulled into a gas station, the car sputtering to a stop. He sat there for a moment, staring blankly at the dashboard, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Sarah broke the silence. "What now?" David's jaw clenched, his voice a whisper. "I don't know." He stepped out of the car, leaning against the hood as he stared into the dim glow of the gas station lights. The night felt unnaturally still, as though the shadow of the house still followed them. Sarah sat silently inside, her thoughts replaying the horrors they had endured. The shadow's voice, the piercing screams, the crushing cold it felt as though it had branded itself into her soul. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the seat. She whispered to herself, "Never again. Never again." By morning, they reached the city. David dropped Sarah off outside her apartment. She stepped out of the car without a word, her movements mechanical. "Sarah," David called, his voice hesitant. She turned to look at him, her expression hard, distant. "I hope you got what you wanted," she said quietly. "Because I lost something in that house, David. I don't think I'll ever get it back." David stared at her, guilt etched into every line of his face. "I didn't mean for this to happen, neither did the people who built that house," Sarah replied, her voice bitter. "But it doesn't change anything." She turned and walked up the steps to her building without looking back, the door closing behind her with a hollow thud. Days turned into weeks, and David's life began to crumble. The money he had hoped to squeeze out of his parents was no longer an option. After the disastrous weekend, his father refused to speak to him, his mother's disappointment cutting him to the bone. Loan sharks called day and night. His debts piled higher, and his once flimsy confidence evaporated into a black pit of desperation. He stopped sleeping every time he closed his eyes. He saw them. The shadowed figures. The cold. The whispers. One evening, as David sat alone in his tiny, darkened apartment, a soft creaking sound filled the air. He froze, his blood running cold. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. At first, there was nothing, just darkness. But then it shifted. A figure emerged, a shape darker than the shadows, impossibly thin. Its head tilted to one side. David's breath caught in his throat. No, the whisper curled through the air, familiar and chilling. The debt must be paid. The lights flickered. The walls groaned. The air turned ice cold. David screamed. As for Sarah, she never took another quick gig again. She left acting school and tried to build a quiet life, but the nightmares never stopped. The woman in her dreams still wept in dark corners, and she often awoke feeling like someone was watching her. No matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that the house and whatever lurked within it had marked her. The Bennett house, back in the forgotten countryside, sat quiet and still. To any outsider, it looked like just another decaying home lost to time. But inside, the air was thick with shadows, and the walls whispered softly to themselves. Waiting. The family's sins remained unpaid, and the darkness still lingered, patient and hungry. The debt would always be collected. The end.